One of the primary causes of the phenomenon of American imperialism was economics. We needed places to sell our amazing new products. And at the time, China actually had all of the customers, because apparently it was opposite day. It's also not an accident that the US began pursuing imperialism in earnest during the 1890s, as this was, in many ways, a decade of crisis in America. The influx of immigrants in the crowded cities added to anxiety and concern over America's future, and then, to cap it all off, in 1893, a panic caused by the failure of a British bank led the US into a horrible economic depression. A Great Depression, but not the Great Depression. According to American diplomatic historian George Herring, imperialism was just what the doctor ordered to help America get out of its depression. In 1890, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History and argued that to be a great power, like Great Britain, the U.S. needed to control the seas and dominate international commerce. We would need ships, and in order to have a functioning two-ocean navy, we would need colonies. Why? Because the steamships at the time were powered by coal, and in order to refuel, they needed coal depots. I mean, I suppose we could have, rented harbor space, but why rent when you can conquer? Also, nationalism and the accompanying pride in one's country was a worldwide phenomenon to which the U.S. was not immune. I mean, it's no accident that the 1890s saw Americans begin to recite the Pledge of Allegiance and celebrate Flag Day. And what better way to instill national pride than by flying the stars and stripes over Guam?
The decision to buy Alaska from Russia in 1867 has mostly been considered a good deal for the United States. The U.S. bought Alaska for $7.2 million, which in 2015 dollars is actually $180.5 million.
U.S. Secretary of State William Seward met in Washington with Russian Minister Eduard de Stockel to negotiate a deal. After staying up all night negotiating, the two finally agreed to a deal, signing a treaty at 4 a.m. on March 30th, 1867, with the United States buying the territory for $7.2 million, or about 2 cents per acre. 50 cents an acre in today's money due to inflation. The Senate approved the purchase on April 9th, and President Andrew Johnson signed the treaty on May 28th. Americans chose to call the area Alaska, an Aleut name. The land, an area over twice the size of Texas, officially joined the country on October 18, 1867. Some people were angry and in shock. These critics of the purchase of Alaska even famously called it Seward's Folly, or Seward's Icebox, basically saying that was a lot of money to spend for an area with not much to offer. They argued no one would be able to move there, and it'd also be hard to control and defend, being so far away. Yet other Americans said it was a wise move, not just for the potential resources hidden there, but for the potential to next try to take over British Columbia. After the purchase, pretty much all of the Russians who lived in Alaska moved back to Russia. Not many Americans lived there either. That is, until Joe Juneau discovered gold there in 1880, and Americans finally began to migrate there. Later they came for the oil, and today Alaska is a very desirable place for many Americans to live, so much more than just an icebox.
The Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe, and this is the golden hour for the United States to pluck it.
In January 1893, a cadre of powerful white planters, led by Sanford Dole and backed by U.S. Marines, orchestrated a coup with an eye to annexing Hawaii to the United States. Their goal was to protect their sugar interests against changing U.S. tariffs and against Queen Liliuokalani, who was showing alarming signs of opposing the strong American influence in Hawaii. Forces within the U.S. government approved the action, wanting to secure American commercial and military interests in the Pacific. Within a few days, a new government was formed, a new constitution was written, and the American flag was hoisted over the government buildings. February brought a treaty of annexation before the Senate, but March brought a new president into the White House, and he approached the development with caution. Resisting a chorus in Congress eager for annexation, Grover Cleveland sent a commissioner to determine the sentiment of the Hawaiian people. When they overwhelmingly indicated that they wanted Queen Lil back, he ordered the Marines back off the island and washed his hands of the whole affair. It was no accident that American interests converged so strongly in the island paradise. Hawaii occupied a strategic position in the Pacific Ocean, marking the western edge of America's sphere of influence. Roughly halfway to China, it was also a convenient way station for Asian trade, a door the U.S. was determined to keep open. Finally, Pearl Harbor, to which the U.S. had gained exclusive rights in 1887, was a compelling military asset. The Hawaiian affair highlighted an emerging struggle in American foreign policy between those who pushed for aggressive expansion and those who questioned the wisdom of acquiring a far-flung empire. Temporarily stymied in the Pacific, the expansionists would nevertheless gain influence in the 1890s, and by the turn of the century, America would assert its place among the nations of the world.
When war broke out with Spain in 1898, the military significance of Hawaiian naval bases as a way station outweighed all other considerations. President William McKinley signed a joint resolution annexing the islands, much like the manner in which Texas joined the Union in 1845.
Because Cuba was just 90 miles south of Florida, and its population was largely Catholic and included Americans, the United States took an intense interest in the inner workings of that island. In 1895, as Cuba was fighting for its independence from Spain, the tabloid press in America continuously reported the story, often noting the horrors of Spanish repression against Cuba.
And these deeply upset Americans for social reasons, for religious reasons, for political reasons, and also in part for economic reasons. Cuba was an important nearby trading partner. People in the U.S. started increasingly calling for intervention into events in Cuba.
In 1898, President William McKinley decided to send the battleship USS Maine to Cuba to protect Americans and American businesses.
That ship had been sent by McKinley to Havana in January 1898 to protect American interests and also to be there in case Americans needed to evacuate the city. The ship explodes. At the time, everyone thought, and the newspapers reported, that it had been attacked, that it had been bombed by the Spanish. A much later investigation, actually in 1976, confirmed what many people in the Navy, even then, some of them actually thought, which was that it was an internal explosion to the ship itself.
The details may have been murky, but the tabloid press called for a war against Spain. The sensational headlines and thinly reported stories came to be known as yellow journalism, named for the yellow ink used in a cartoon in one of the newspapers, Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. The sensational coverage by the tabloids spread anti-Spain sentiment throughout the United States. At first, President McKinley hesitated to take action, but the pressure to go to war with Spain mounted.
The combination of events and the rolling pattern toward war made war almost inevitable. And immediately after the explosion of the Maine, Congress gives McKinley a unanimous declaration urging him to respond. And a few weeks later, he goes back and asks for a formal declaration of war, and that passes easily in April of 1898.
Soon, the war with Spain escalated beyond the Caribbean and into the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Dewey was ordered to attack the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay in the Philippines, another of Spain's territories. He accomplished this quite easily, only a few weeks after Congress declared war.
The initial war with Spain was a war, in many ways, to liberate Cuba. And only later did it become a war to acquire the Spanish Empire. The Philippines is a turning point in that moment. The U.S. Navy primarily conquers the Philippines quite easily in 1898.
By the end of the war with Spain 6 months later, the United States had control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippine Islands.
In 1898, the USA was victorious in the 4-month Spanish-American War. Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam, which all became U.S. territories. Under U.S. rule, Puerto Rico continued its plantation economy, with sugar being the main crop. Puerto Rico underwent many political changes as well. In 1900, the Four-Acre Act required all U.S. laws apply to Puerto Rico and also established a civilian government. The President of the United States appointed a governor and executive council, and citizens of Puerto Rico were able to elect 35 members of its own House of Representatives, as well as 1 member of Congress. That member, however, does not have the right to vote on the federal laws governing the island. Puerto Rico officially became a Commonwealth in 1948, and ever since, the future of Puerto Rico's status has been up for debate.
America is opening up relations with Cuba, and it's a big deal, ending decades of hostility and beginning a new era between the two countries. But to understand just how big of a deal, where that hostility really came from, why it took so long to end, you've got to go back, way back. Not to the 1950s, as many Americans might think, but to the 1850s. The story starts with America divided between pro-slavery and anti-slavery politics, and one of their many fights is over the Spanish colony of Cuba. Pro-slavery lawmakers want to buy Cuba from Spain, or take it by force to turn it into a new slave state. Anti-slavery politicians oppose this, calling it imperialism. But fast forward to 1898, after slavery's over. Americans have a different version of this same argument when Cubans rise up against Spain. The U.S. joins them, starting the Spanish-American War. But Americans divide. Should the U.S. seize Cuba from Spain for itself, or liberate the island? This is part of a much bigger debate at the time over whether the U.S. should explicitly become a European-style imperial power. So this is an argument about Cuba, but it's also an argument about America, what kind of country it should be. Should America be the kind of country that controls Cuba, or that respects it as a fellow sovereign nation? And that argument has continued in different forms ever since. At this point, in 1898, that fight happens in Congress. Each side passes laws trying to force their way. And it ends up with a weird split baby policy, with Cuba winning independence, but other quasi-imperial American rule. The U.S. would take over Guantanamo Bay, dictate Cuba's foreign policy, and give itself the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Then came the American interventions in Cuba in 1906, 1917. Each time, the U.S. military takes over for a few years, ostensibly to resolve some political crisis, but that usually means protecting American interests, such as sugar imports.
During the Spanish-American War of 1898, the United States wrested the Philippine Islands from Spain, and the Filipinos were pleased to be liberated from Spanish rule.
The Filipinos had been fighting for many years for their own independence from Spain, and although they temporarily welcomed the Americans' help in that liberation, Filipinos themselves thought that what they were fighting for was an independent Philippines. And when they realized the Americans were becoming an occupying and colonial power, they began a fight against them.
Some people in the United States voiced concerns over America's growing imperialism and the ongoing war in the Philippines. Social reformer Jane Addams, industrialist Andrew Carnegie, labor leader Samuel Gompers, philosopher John Dewey, author Mark Twain, and others joined forces to fight the annexation of the Pacific and Caribbean territories taken over during the war with Spain.
The Anti-Imperialist League was a loose confederation of people who didn't share much in common except the fact that they were opposed to imperialism. Some of them were northeastern elites intellectuals who opposed it for their own reasons. Some of them were people who had business interests in the U.S. that might be threatened by new colonies, particularly colonies that produced sugar.
But American imperialists argued that it would be wrong to leave these countries now that America had interests there.
In part, the imperialists had on their side the fact that it was a fait accompli, right? That if the war was done, the empire was built, and it would be wrong to leave now. It would leave Filipinos and various Caribbean peoples in the lurch. They also said that there was a moral mission, that the U.S. could do good in these areas, and it was hard to argue against that.
Imperialists also pointed out the military importance of American-controlled ports in faraway places like the Philippine Islands, giving America's new Navy safe harbors while protecting American interests around the world.
The Philippines was America's principal experience with the costs and dangers of imperialism, because the acquisition of the Philippines was followed by a long, brutal war between the American troops and Filipino nationalists, a war that was much longer, much more costly, much more deadly than the Spanish-American War, although a war that's largely forgotten in American history. It was much like the Vietnam War in many ways.
It took more than 3 years and 4,000 American lives to bring an end to the fighting in the Philippines. In 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt installed William Howard Taft as Governor General of the islands. In 1916, the United States promised self-government to the Filipinos, but full independence would not come until 1946.
The beginning of the 20th century found the 2,000-year-old Chinese empire in decline. Foreign powers descended like vultures on what was left of the dying Manchu dynasty. The once powerful Chinese people fumed as they saw their land and protectorates taken over by foreigners. Hong Kong and Burma were lost to England, Korea to Japan, and Vietnam to France. As the power structure within the Manchu court struggled to maintain its tenuous control within China, foreign encroachment intensified internal political conflicts. What had been an ancient closed society was threatened by the corruption of progress and foreign influence.
When the United States gained control of the Philippines as a result of the Spanish-American War, many saw the possession of the islands as a gateway to large markets in mainland Asia. American products could be sold there, and many capitalists envisioned a new and untapped market for investors in large-scale railroad construction. At the dawn of the 20th century, American factories were producing more goods than the country could consume, and the continued growth of the American economy depended on exports to foreign markets. China had been weakened by war and enormous amounts of foreign intervention. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Japan all had established settlements along China's coast. These nations also managed sizable spheres of influence where each country maintained strict economic control. The U.S. government and American investors began to fear a future in which China would be carved into European colonies that were closed to American products and companies. With American interest in mind, the U.S. Secretary of State, John Hay, issued a series of policy statements that became known as the Open Door Notes. These were letters addressed to the leaders of European powers, suggesting that nations share trading rights in China. This would create what Hay referred to as an open door. It would be in the best interest of all, he argued, if no one country held a monopoly on trade in any part of China.
In China's capital, Peking, where from these ancient altars countless emperors had sought the mandate of heaven, the myth of heavenly rule persisted still. But deep within the palaces where China's Manchu emperors reigned, by 1900 that myth too was dead. For here ruled China's evil spirit, the Empress Dowager Cixi, a Manchu concubine, bedmate to an emperor for whom she had produced an heir. A woman with a gift of malice, said to have poisoned her own son upon his throne, installed her infant nephew as emperor, killed his mother, had then imprisoned him in 1898. An ignorant woman, but unchallenged ruler of the empire. Her court, a whispering of ladies-in-waiting and eunuch favorites. Chief among them, eunuch Li Lianying, as depraved as she. When told China needed ships to fight the foreigners, they used naval appropriations to build a marble pleasure boat in a nearby lake.
Hostilities that had been simmering for decades exploded when China declared war against the foreign powers of France, Russia, England, Japan, Austria, Italy, Germany, and the United States. The Chinese became distrustful of foreigners and were greatly concerned by the influx of Christian missionaries who converted an increasing number of Chinese to an alien religion. A campaign of terror had begun the previous year when a secret organization called the Boxers began killing Christian missionaries and their converts in the northern provinces of China. The Boxers were a clandestine social society that had been in existence since the early 1700s. The group preached a mixture of Buddhist, Confucian, and Taoist ideas and was rabidly opposed to any change in ancient culture. Members practiced a form of shadow boxing and believed that followers of the cult were invulnerable.
1,000 villages deep in China mirrored her primitive hatred of the foreign devil. Moreover, their passions had found flag and leaders as a secret brotherhood, the Boxers, began to flourish. Kill the white man, burn his mission, said the Boxers, claiming magic charms could make their bodies impervious to Western bullets. With the Empress' consent, in early 1900, they began to kill. One of America's great novelists, then a missionary child, was at the time in China. Miss Pearl Buck recalls,
the Empress Dowager had issued an edict that all white people were to be killed, and many had been killed, especially in the north, in Shandong, where men, women, and children, missionaries and business people too, had been killed. But we were so fortunate because we lived in the province of Jiangsu, and we had a very good viceroy, an intelligent man, and he knew that it was folly for the old empress to think that she could gain anything by killing the missionaries and the business people, because there would be terrible retribution. And so he was so courageous as to insert a negative, a no, a not, into the imperial edict, so that it read, we were not to be killed. And that's what saved our lives.
In May of 1900, the Boxers killed 4 French and Belgian railway engineers. This was followed by the murder of the Japanese chancellor in Peking. The foreign powers responded by sending ships and troops to China. The imperial court had initially condemned the Boxer violence and had sent government troops to quell the uprising. But the ruling Dowager Empress, Cixi, was eventually won over to the Boxer cause as a result of foreign attacks on Chinese forts, and the rumor that the foreign powers wanted to return her deposed nephew to power.
Here at Peking, within these massive walls, for almost 2 months, 3,000 foreigners and Christian converts gathered under siege to fight for life. Their sandbagged embassies a bastion against Boxer fanatics. From around the world, navies rushed troops to raise the siege. Britons, Americans, Russians, French, Germans, Japanese raced with field guns and modern rifles, whose bullets no Boxer magic could resist.
Seeing American interests threatening the area, the U.S. government prepared to respond. In August of 1900, the U.S. sent 2,500 soldiers to China to protect American citizens and interests there.
On June 20th, the Boxers invaded Peking, brandishing spears topped with the heads of murdered missionaries. They laid siege to the foreign legations, where almost 1,000 foreigners and 3,000 Chinese Christians had taken refuge.
Thousands of Chinese died as a result of the fighting. After the conflict ended, John Hay issued a second series of open door notes, stating that the United States would safeguard the principle of open trade for all nations in the Chinese Empire. This action established the United States as a major player in the post-Boxer Rebellion China, as well as on the global stage.
What Roosevelt had in mind for foreign policy, however, would be much more radical. While president, Theodore Roosevelt officially renamed the executive mansion the White House and added the West Wing. Theodore Roosevelt had been the greatest political force behind the Spanish-American War. He saw America's emergence as a world power not only necessary for survival, but a duty. He felt Americans had a responsibility to civilize the rest of the world.
He made the country realize that we now, in a post-Spanish-American War era, had a global responsibility. We were no longer a country being born, that we were now a world leader, and that with that came a new kind of global responsibility.
Roosevelt, more than anybody, believed America needed a canal through the Central American Isthmus owned by Colombia.
The thought was this canal was going to be a way to protect both seas of America, that any moment if the East Coast was attacked, the West Coast fleet could quickly come to its aid.
Now, Roosevelt believed this canal, the Panama Canal, would be a very good thing for the United States, but he believed it would also be a very good thing for the world.
The Colombian government didn't exactly agree with Roosevelt, at least not at the price he was offering. So, once again, Roosevelt took unorthodox measures. He backed a local revolution and helped create the nation of Panama in exchange for the right to build a canal there.
He was criticized very heavily for his high-handed role in dealing with the government of an independent American republic, for basically giving them the back of his hand, and for fomenting revolution. But he never apologized.
He used to say, I didn't steal the Panama Canal, I built it.
It was the largest engineering project ever undertaken. And when it was completed, it became one of the wonders of the world.
When it opened, Roosevelt believed that that was his major contribution to world civilization, and he never changed his mind about that.
But America was not the only one infiltrating Latin America. Increasingly, European powers were moving into the region, ostensibly for the purpose of forcing debtor nations to repay their loans. Roosevelt found their presence a strategic threat. Without consulting Congress or asking permission from Latin America, Roosevelt invoked the Monroe Doctrine and stated that the U.S. was now in charge of the Western Hemisphere.
Roosevelt announced that henceforth the United States would consider that it held a police power, that was the term he used, to enforce good behavior on the countries of the Western Hemisphere. This was simply his way of saying, if somebody has to clean up the neighborhood, it's going to be the United States.
It was a bold position to take, and Roosevelt backed it up with what he called big stick diplomacy.
I mean, his famous quote is, "Speak softly and carry a big stick."
Meaning you don't have to yell at people abroad, but at every minute you have to be militarily prepared. The big stick is your arsenal. It is your Navy. And this was a way of intimidating other countries in realizing that we were going to fight for American rights. If you sacked a consulate somewhere, or if you intercepted and impressed an American ship, there were going to be consequences.
The 14 points. On January 8, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson delivered his famous 14-point speech, where he outlined a plan to end World War I and secure world peace. When the war broke out in 1914, Wilson adopted a policy of neutrality, with no intention of involving the U.S. in a foreign war. But the U.S. couldn't remain isolated for long. In January 1917, British intelligence intercepted and decoded a message known as the Zimmermann Telegram, in which Germany asked Mexico to ally with them against the United States. Then, on February 1st of the same year, Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare and started sinking merchant and passenger ships with U.S. citizens on board, something they had agreed not to do after sinking the Lusitania in 1915. The Lusitania, a British ocean liner, was torpedoed without warning, leading to the deaths of over 1,100 people, including 128 Americans. This was the final straw. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Germany. Just 2 days later, on April 4th, Congress declared war. The war was brutal and expensive. In a little under 2 years of fighting, the U.S. had spent $32 billion and lost over 116,000 men. Wilson wanted the war to end, but when announcing his 14 points in January of 1918, Wilson didn't just want to end the war to protect America, he hoped to prevent wars from ever happening again. So together with his advisor and friend, Colonel Edward M. House, President Wilson organized a group of 150 political and social scientists to study Allied and American policy all over the globe, collecting nearly 2,000 reports and 1,200 maps. This would inform the idealistic 14 points, which would address causes of the World War and also propose solutions to ensure world peace in the future through policy and negotiations. 8 of the 14 points were aimed at resolving specific territorial issues among the countries involved in combat, and securing borders and statehood for Italy, the Turkish part of the Ottoman Empire, Poland, and Austria-Hungary. 5 points covered general principles for a peaceful world: open treaties and agreements, freedom of the seas, free trade, reduction of armaments, and adjustment of colonial claims to land. These were all based on the principles of self-determination, the idea that nations should have the right to govern themselves without interference from other countries. The 14th and most influential point proposed that countries form an alliance to guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity of great and small states alike. The 14-point speech reflected a tradition of diplomatic idealism that would come to define Wilson's presidency. But how did that idealism translate into action? Well, most of Wilson's points were never fully realized. But one point in particular would have a big impact on the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I. When the Allies met in Versailles to create a treaty to end the war, they were less interested in Wilson's idealistic vision and more interested in regaining what they had lost and punishing Germany. To Wilson's disappointment, the points were barely integrated, and only to the benefit of the Allies. Most of them weren't actually adopted or honored by anyone after the treaty was signed. However, the 14th point was incorporated: the creation of a world organization providing collective security. This would later be known as the League of Nations. Ironically, despite a campaign from Wilson, the U.S. never actually joined the League of Nations. And Wilson foreshadowed that without American membership in the League, there would be another world war within a generation. Sure enough, World War II would break out just 20 years later.